Tonight we're in Hull. Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, former Brexit Minister, now Chairman of the Conservative Party, James Cleverly; Anneliese Dodds, Labour's Shadow Treasury Minister and a former MEP; Energy Secretary in the Coalition Government alongside the Conservatives, Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey; Ian Blackford, Leader of the SNP at Westminster, and elected as an MEP earlier this year, Chairman of the Brexit Party, Richard Tice. Welcome to our panel here, to our audience and, of course, to you at home. Do join in the conversation, argue along in the usual way using hashtag BBCQT on Facebook, on Twitter and on Instagram. Right, let's take our first question. Without further ado, from Josh Overton.
Hello there. What is the point of getting Brexit done, as has become what this election is about, if it won't solve any of the problems normal British people actually care about?
And what problems are you thinking of, Josh?
Well, the NHS crisis, the underfunding of schools, the general failure of most public services in the country.
OK. James? This is something Boris Johnson's very keen on saying, isn't he?
So, I think there are a number of things about getting Brexit done. Firstly, it goes to the heart of what democracy means, because we had a referendum in 2016, and at that referendum, both sides of the campaign, both sides of the debate...
That's not what the question's about, James. The question is not about the democracy. It's what's the point of getting it done if it won't solve any of the problems normal British people care about? And well, Josh didn't mention democracy. They talked about the NHS, about education, austerity, that kind of thing.
But the point I'm saying is it goes to the heart of the integrity of our democratic process, and that, in turn, is what underpins all the things that you're saying. Now, the reason that we say get Brexit done so that we can invest in the NHS, in police and education and that kind of stuff, is because whether we are in the European Union or have left the European Union affects the government's ability to intervene, invest and other things. So until and unless you have a plan to deliver Brexit, you can't have a credible plan for anything else. And actually, what we're seeing, like with the PISA results, is we're seeing our educational standards increasing. But what we want to do as a government is we want to go further. We want to invest more in education, more in the NHS, more in policing, so that we can continue the improvements that we have seen and improve things where...
Not in the NHS. You presume you're not talking about improvements in the NHS. It's had the worst A&E waiting figures
we'd love to.
On record.
Well, and that's...
After 10 years of Conservative government.
And that's because what we've seen over that period of time is record increases in demand. So more people are using the NHS than ever before.
And not record increases in spending, obviously.
No, we have got record increases in spending. We're spending more now on the NHS than we've ever done in the past, but we need to go further. And in order to be able to go further, we need to have a resolution and certainty over Brexit. And that's why we're saying it's important we get this done, so we know what financial framework we've got, what regulatory framework we've got, whether we're in part of the Growth and Stability Pact or not. And so, as I say, until you've got a plan to deliver Brexit, you don't have a plan for anything.
Does that answer your question, Josh?
To some degree, I would say there's a lot more rhetoric there than I'd like to hear. I suppose the core of the question is how. How is what you're proposing going to help people? And how are all these men and women who are dying on trolleys because you're not funding the NHS properly going to be saved, going to be helped because we're not in the EU anymore? I don't...
Well, very briefly, because then I want to come around the panel.
Sure. I mean, I think you're connecting two different things. So the point is that we want to invest in the public services, and we've got a plan to do so. That plan builds on the investment that we've already put in these public services. But separate to that, why we are so keen to make sure we get Brexit done is because all of us, all the parties represented at this table tonight, promised we would respect the referendum result. And as it stands, the Conservatives are the ones who are actually delivering on that promise.
Anneliese.
that Boris Johnson's deal is not going to put an end to this wrangling, because all it deals with is just how we would leave the EU. There's nothing in there that sets out what our future relationship would look like. So if we think that if Boris Johnson gets in, that he'll get Brexit done and that'll be it, and finally we can concentrate on all these important matters, we're deluding ourselves. That's not going to be the reality.
Hang on.
We'll have, may I finish? We'll have many more years of argument over the future relationship. Labour's approach is different. We've said that we've had MPs arguing about this for 3 years, about what way they want to leave in, whether they want to leave. We're saying, let's put this to the people, let you have your say, with a deal that's not the damaging deal that Boris Johnson's presenting, with one that actually says what the situation will look like in the future, as well as now, and put that up against Remain. Well, no, it's not, because it will enable people to have their say on that reasonable deal versus Remain for the first time in 3 years. You know, while MPs have been arguing, you've been cut out of the argument, and that shouldn't happen. We get it dealt with, and then we can get on with dealing with those matters.
Can you explain? On the one hand, the Labour position is extraordinary. I mean, it's basically Remain or a version of fudged Remain. You know, there won't be a credible leave option on the table. But the truth is, you say that phase 2, talking about the future simple free trade deal, will take years. And yet you also say that the Labour position is we can get this done in 3 months and have a referendum in 3 months. That doesn't compute. That doesn't work, does it? There's an enormous...
It does compute.
It doesn't compute at all.
Maybe you haven't looked at the Labour plans, but we've said that we would essentially take what Theresa May had before, plus a customs union that sets out the future trajectory. We would set that up against Remain and let people say...
You think you could do that in 3 months, and yet you don't think it's possible to negotiate a free trade deal in 11 months?
To the people. No, I don't.
They're different things, Richard.
It's a completely different thing. There's already a customs union within the EU.
That we want to leave. We voted to leave. So we voted to leave the customs union.
With respect,
we
didn't.
Did. We absolutely did. We voted to leave.
With respect, we didn't. People voted to leave the EU, with various Leave politicians saying that that would mean leaving a customs union or the customs union, others saying, oh, no, it won't. Actually, it's not going to look anything like that.
That wasn't on the ballot paper. On the ballot paper was leave. Let's just all remember that.
Do you know what? Let's not have a wrangle here. Let's see what our audience got, because there's so many hands up. Yes, the woman in the red and black top there with the glasses, yeah.
Hiya, yeah. The problem I've got is I'm a traditional Labour voter, Green alignment as well, Green Party alignment, but I voted to leave, and there isn't one party that represents me. I haven't got a clue what I'm going to do on Thursday, because I don't want to vote Tory. I don't want to live with Tories' policies, but they're the only parties that are saying they'll get out. Labour are leaving Remain on the referendum. If they get in and they do what they're going to do, they're leaving Remain as an option. If you were saying our deal or no deal, I would vote Labour, because I agree with a lot of your policies, but you're choosing to leave Remain if you get in to have another rerun of the referendum and leave Remain as an option.
The woman in the white T-shirt here in the front.
I don't think it's particularly fair to have another vote on something we've already voted for, personally. I am a Labour voter, and I don't understand how we can continue to keep voting on the subjects we've already voted for. Let's just get it done. You know, the issue is the services that are struggling. You're not going to get time to sort those issues out if you're still sat at that table deciding what you want to do. Just get it done.
All right. The woman there in the glasses. Yes.
Mr. Tice and Mr. Cleverly talk about how it's democratic and how we voted for it, but only 37.7% of the electorate voted leave. And in the first Scottish devolution referendum, just as an example, there needed to be a threshold of 40% of the electorate voting to have a devolved assembly. So why is it different now that you're saying we voted for it and it's democratic when it's technically illegitimate?
And I'm here in the grey T-shirt.
Just to James, in terms of what you said in terms of public funding, you can find £1 billion when you need to blackmail the DUP into voting for you. You can find money when it suits you. That's disgraceful behaviour and it shouldn't be allowed. In terms of Labour, we voted for Brexit. We didn't vote for half in, half out. We got a leaflet, leave the single market, leave the customs union, to leave. We didn't vote for any half measures. What you're trying to do is cloud in the water because you don't like the decision. You were disgraced. You shouldn't be sat there and you should be gone. We'll vote you out eventually.
OK, it's just a minute. Ian, you're sitting...
right.
It's unusually quiet there.
I'm sitting listening to...
It's the quietest I've ever heard you, actually.
Well, I'm reflecting on what people are saying. Look, I understand the strength of opinion that there is here in Hull, but the question was about what is the point of getting Brexit done. The issue is, if the UK does leave on the basis of what Boris Johnson has put forward, that is simply not getting Brexit done, because we've got to go into the trade talks on the future relationship. And I have to say to you, there is no experience of any country that's conducted and completed trade talks with the European Union in 11 months. It's just not possible. So the harsh reality is, if Boris Johnson delivers what he's saying he's going to do to you, it means that the risk of that no-deal Brexit becomes ever closer. That will happen at the end of 2020. And any rational economic analysis has showed that people are going to pay a price for that. Jobs are going to be lost. And in Scotland, we'd be talking about losing up to 100,000 jobs. And of course, we were told in our own referendum in 2014, if we stayed in the UK, that we'd been stayed in Europe. And so for us in Scotland, we've got a very simple choice at this election, because we're not prepared to be taken out of the European Union against our will. And we've got the option of protecting ourselves and becoming an independent country. But on this issue of public services, because there is no doubt that the NHS is a massive issue, and let me make an offer to the people here, because what we've suggested is that NHS spending should increase to the level that we currently have in Scotland, which is £136 higher than what it is here in England. Now, that would mean that you'd have an increase in health spending over the lifetime of the next Parliament in the UK of about 35 billion. We get an extra 4 billion in Scotland. But the challenge of delivering for public services, I have to tell you, is going to get an awful lot harder if Brexit happens, because the economy is going to be weaker. Yes. The best deal that we've got is the one that's staying in the European Union.
Let me just take you back there, because you're saying, obviously, if Brexit does go through next year, obviously depending on who wins the election, you then have a big decision to make. Are you seriously suggesting, because Nicola Sturgeon has obviously talked about having a second independence referendum, if she can, next year, are you suggesting that you would count into a situation where Scotland would come out of the EU because of the actions of the rest of the UK, and come out of the UK in the same year?
Well, we face a very real threat.
But would you do that, realistically?
Let me say to people...
Leave your two largest trading blocs in the same year?
Well, the European Union is 8 times larger than the UK when it comes to trade. But I'd simply
but you'd be out of the EU and you'd come out of the UK as well?
No, we wouldn't, because as things stand at the moment, if Boris Johnson wins, and if we leave the European Union at the end of January, then we're in transition till at least the end of this year. So in effect, we're in the single market, we're in the customs union. The people in Scotland were given the opportunity to vote for the SNP in 2016 in the Scottish elections, and we had a manifesto commitment that if we won that election, on a change of circumstances, that we demanded the right to have a referendum. That is democracy. And I'd simply say to whether it's Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn or anyone else, that you've got to respect the votes that the SNP have gained, the mandate they've gained. And if the people in Scotland next week send the majority of SNP MPs back to Westminster on the basis of Scotland's right to choose, it will ill behold anyone that stops Scotland exercising its right, and yes, having an independent...
Well, let's get back to the question. Let's get back to the question in a minute. With Josh's question, which is, what's the point of getting Brexit done if it won't solve any of the problems normal British people care about? Ed?
Well, Josh is right. The real problem is Brexit won't solve any of the problems. All the economic forecasters show that growth will be lower. That means tax revenues that fund our public services, our health, our schools, our police, will be lower. That's not helping people. Since the referendum, 5,000 nurses have left, EU nurses have left the country when we have a staff shortage in our NHS. How's that going to help the things that people care about? But let me finish. Climate change is an international issue. If you're not at the international table working with other countries, you're not likely to solve climate change. You know, I remember 3 years ago, there was a guy called President Trump. He got elected saying, build the wall. You know, he's not built the wall 3 years later. They've just started a little section of a 2,000-mile wall. And this is exactly what Boris Johnson, his friend, is saying. Get Brexit done. He won't get it done for 3 years or more. There's no way he can get it done. I was a trade minister. I've been involved in trade negotiations at the WTO, at the EU, with countries outside the EU. You will never get a trade deal done in 12 months. And that means December next year will be either faced with no deal, which will mean loss of income, shortages of food and so on, or he'll have to go back on his word. That is the truth. That is what the evidence shows.
Ed, you know that's just pure scaremongering and garbage. Don't scare the British people. It's totally wrong.
Don't mislead the British people. You've been misleading them for years. Everybody
You're part of Project
you have been misleading them. Hang on, not Project Fear.
It's Project Fear.
We have lost 5,000 nurses to our NHS since the referendum. Explain that.
Since the referendum, we employ over 1 million people more than we did at the referendum, and yet you were part of Project Fear that said that 500,000 jobs would go, the banks would go, the tech firms would flee.
Richard,
forget that conveniently.
Richard,
Now it.
do you want to address the original question?
Yes, go on. How's Brexit going to help us?
The great thing, as James was saying, the great thing, Josh, about Brexit helping us is that it is the foundation of our democracy. The people were told that the government would carry out the will of the people. Here we are, 3.5 years later.
What about jobs?
We employ 1 million people more than we did then.
Okay, guys, hang on 1 second. Just no, wait a minute. No, I don't want to hear from you either, James.
Yeah,
Stop talking. How do you think it's going so far? Do we really want to hear you shouting over each other? I, for one, do not. So let's just have a civilised conversation. Now, there's only a week to go, but really, is this any way to go on? Richard, do you want to answer the question?
I'm trying to, but I got interrupted. Josh, the point is, trust in democracy is seriously damaged because 3.5 years later, we haven't yet left. Knocking on doors in the constituency that I'm standing, I'm constantly told by people, we are furious, we're frustrated, we're annoyed. And we're either going to vote for a different party, hopefully the Brexit Party, or, tragically, they're not going to vote at all because they've lost all trust in all politicians. And that is a disaster for trust in democracy. Once we've left, then actually the government of the day can get on with organising and doing and running the country much more efficiently. That's the key.
OK, I'm going to hear a little bit more from the audience before I move on. So, yes, the woman here in the front.
Well, personally, I feel democracy's failed me because back 3 years ago, I had a ballot paper and it said remain or leave. And I was promised that whatever my choice was, I would get that choice, and I haven't. And it just feels like we don't like the answer, so let's have best out of 2, best out of 3. How long's it going to go on for? Another referendum is absolutely ridiculous. The people have spoken once, so do what the people have asked.
OK, what about the man behind you, then? No, yes, that's it.
Yeah, I hate to take it back to the original question, but
go on, be
and what you said, Dick, has nothing to do with any of it whatsoever. It's not going to help in any way. That's got nothing to do with it whatsoever. The problems have got nothing to do with Brexit. The problems have been inflicted by the Tories for the last 10 years. You've treated the working class with disregard for 10 years, and you're using Brexit as a tool to say that everybody that's against it, it's a scapegoat. You've treated with absolute disregard for a long time, and it's got nothing to do with Brexit.
OK, let me take one more. The man in the blue sweater towards the back, yeah.
You've heard it in this room many times from people of all political persuasions. We told you 3 years ago we wanted to leave. Now, please, get on with it.
And yes, the woman at the back with the ponytail, yes, you.
Right, so last time I checked, we lived in a democracy, and surely that means people have a right to have their say. So giving it back to the people to see what they want seems like the most logical thing. And if opinions haven't changed, if people still want to leave, then that's what will happen. But if things have changed, then surely that should be made known, and then we would stay, because it's up to us to decide, not the politicians.
OK. Now, I'm going to move on, Ed, if I may, because we've got a lot of questions to go through, and they're not all, amazingly, about Brexit. Let's hear from Laura Cookson.
I've taken a big pay cut, but I plan on a massive spending spree this Christmas. Is this pure fantasy?
I wonder what you could be referring to, Laura, there. Richard, why don't you kick us off on this?
Well, I mean, both main parties, Laura, have been, all of a sudden they've found the magic money tree, a magic money forest, all sorts of commitments. And I think, actually, many voters up and down the country know that most of it is pure fantasy. And maybe, actually, instead of just pouring more money, what we should be doing is making sure, first of all, are we spending the existing taxpayers' money, are we spending it properly?
So you're critical of both Conservatives
Well, I'm just
and
concerned.
Labour.
I'm concerned, and I'm hearing it on the doorstep. Voters do not believe all these huge promises, these tens of billions that previously weren't available, and now all of a sudden they're available. We're saying, for example, in the Brexit Party, we want to spend over 100 billion on local road and rail schemes in the regions, such as here in Yorkshire and the North East. But we're saying let's scrap HS2 in order to pay for it. The problem with all the other main parties is that they're just printing money everywhere and no one's got any idea really how it's truthfully going to pay for it. Let's take the Labour Party. They suddenly found 60 billion overnight, which wasn't even in their manifesto, in order to try and bribe some women for their votes.
Bribing. Well, it's not bribing those women. It was a historical injustice that they were done out of their pensions.
Why wasn't it in your manifesto?
Because it's a one-off payment. And actually, maybe I can answer the question now, if you don't mind. Actually, what we're saying is that for day-to-day public spending, we'll have a different approach. We set it out very clearly, and I'm very happy to give you a copy of it so that you can see exactly where that additional funding is going to come from.
What about that spending pledge, Anneliese, that Labour spending plans would leave each family, an average family, £6,700 better off? I mean, that's been roundly rubbished, hasn't it?
I don't think it has been rubbished. I haven't seen it being rubbished
well,
anywhere.
Okay,
That's the impact
okay. Well, I'm just looking at the
plan.
various fact-checking organisations. So, Full Fact, for example, are saying that 75% of those savings, the 6,700, would come from childcare for 3- and 4-year-olds and from families having 2-season rail tickets. 2/5 of families don't pay anything for childcare. Most families don't have 3- or 4-year-olds. And only 5% of people use a train more than 3 times a week.
Well,
so
actually,
how's that an average family?
Well, in fact, we're looking at many other policies that would impact on families. If you look at an area like this, for example, in Yorkshire and the Humber, about 500,000 people would benefit from our improved minimum wage to £10 an hour.
It doesn't describe an average family by any stretch of imagination, does it?
I think it does, actually. I'm more than happy to go through the detail of those commitments, but I want to make the most important point, which is about where Labour is taking different choices from all of the other parties, because when you look at what's happened since the financial crisis, we have not been in it together. We've seen the very best of people in profitable companies having their taxes reduced, and everybody else has had to deal with the impact of that on public services. Well, we've said...
Funny that, isn't it? When corporation tax is being reduced, actually, corporation tax... If she makes a fib like that, we've got to tell the truth. It is a fib. Corporation tax percentage was reduced, and corporation tax receipts have gone up significantly.
Yes, Richard, if I may, they did go up.
Thank you.
But it was correlation and not causation. They went up because the banks returned to profitability after the financial crisis.
Right.
Go and read it in the Financial Times and everywhere else.
It's because companies have got more money to invest.
Richard, you've got to let Anneliese speak.
Yeah.
Thank you. With respect, it isn't nonsense. There are very large numbers of economists who have spent, many hours looking at this, and they say, yes, the amount of corporation tax has gone up, but not because of that reduction in rates. In fact, the latest figures suggested even more has been lost from government coffers because of that reduction. Labour said we're going to have a different approach. We think those with the broadest shoulders should be putting in a bit more, and we'd use that money to properly fund our public services. That's what people want overwhelmingly, and we're going to make that change.
And Laura, does that convince you? Does that convince you, Laura?
No, it doesn't.
Why not?
Because I don't see how the proposed tax, is it top 5% earners? I don't see how that's going to generate enough revenue for the level of investment that you're talking about. And whilst I agree with the sentiment that we need this investment, I mean, just education is screaming out for money. Yeah. I work in education, I know firsthand. But we have to be realistic about where that comes from. And it has to come from taxation, and it's going to have to come from wider taxation on a wider, proportion of the population. I am happy to pay more. And I feel, I'm not in that 5%. I'm happy to pay more tax, so I know that my daughter can go to a secondary school, have a full set of textbooks in a classroom. If she needs a TA is there to support her. But at the moment, and that, it has to be spread. We all have a responsibility to fund this.
And Laura, the Institute for Fiscal Studies has also suggested that taking extra taxation top 5% is just not going to provide enough revenue?
Well, the IFS have said that our plans are ambitious. I'm quite proud of the fact that they're ambitious. They've said that, for example,
well, they've said that won't generate enough income. That's what they've said.
Well, actually, when you go through exactly what they've said about our plans, they say that, for example, the amount that we would be raising from some of our corporate tax plans is more than what we've estimated in our plans. I would really recommend that people actually take a look at what we've set out there with our manifesto. We were the only major party to do that at the last general election. We've done it again this time. Please look at the plans. And I think when you do, you'll see that we can generate that revenue. And it's by changing the dial. I don't think it's right that ordinary people have had to suck up the pain of the impact of the financial crisis, while those at the very top and profitable companies have had tax cuts. That's just not fair, and we'll correct that.
And James, after 10 years of austerity under the Conservative government, suddenly you seem to have found some money somewhere.
Well, the reason that we are able to make financial commitments, as we did in the spending review before the election and in our manifesto, is because of the decisions that we made in government over the last 10 years.
So you think they were the right decisions, they didn't go too far?
Because of the decisions we made in government over the last 10 years, businesses have stayed afloat. I remember in previous recessions, businesses going under, people having to hand back their keys to their homes because they couldn't make up their mortgage payments, rampant levels of unemployment. Actually, what we have seen is unemployment has remained low, interest rates have remained low. There are more people in work than ever before, more people paying income tax, even though we have increased the personal allowance, so the people on the lowest pay paying less income tax. And because we've kept the economy strong and growing, we are now able to spend the money in the public services that we know need to be spent. But the point is, and the point that Laura, you raised in your question, is that the Labour Party, as a socialist party, used to be much more honest with voters. They used to say, we're going to spend loads and loads and loads of money, but you are going to have to pay for it.
This question was to all of you, it wasn't specifically to Anneliese here.
But you are going to have to pay for it through your taxes. What we now see is the new version of socialism is the big lie that this spending can be funded just by the top 5% of earners and big companies. And the IFS have completely rubbished that assessment. So ultimately, that tax will be paid, and John McDonnell had to admit that.
And don't forget, the IFS didn't find your plans credible either.
No. That point.
So presumably, if you think they're right about Labour, they must be right about the Conservatives as well.
But the point is that John McDonnell conceded that some of the lowest earners in society would see their taxes rise, and I think the Labour Party should be honest about that.
I'm sorry, I can't let you get away with that. We have said that, for example, we will remove the marriage allowance because we think it's not fair that people who aren't married don't have that benefit. But we have proven that everybody who is fitting under that category at the moment would be better under a Labour government. It is not right to say that the worst off will be suffering. My goodness, they are now, and we're going to set that right under a Labour government.
The maths just doesn't stack up.
Well, the IFS didn't think your maths stacked up either, in fairness. The woman in the black top.
Personally, I don't think either of your maths stack up, but it's really a question for Labour. I've never voted Labour before, and I'm thinking of it. I'm not sure. As a small business...
out of interest, what's making you think of it this time?
Simply the complete lack of underfunding to every area in society today. And I know that you're going to turn around as a Tory and say, well, Labour messed it all up before and this is what we've had to do to address the balance, but how far is it going to go? Anyway, that's beside the by. I don't think, as a small business owner, a landlady of a pub, for example, this grand plan to introduce the minimum wage to £10 an hour, I don't think you've really thought that through, because personally, we pay our staff £9 plus a bonus if they do well, and that, for me personally, I don't think I'm going to have that much trouble in addressing the minimum wage. But for a lot of companies out there, do you not think that there's going to be either job losses or price increases, because the CPI is going to go sky high and it's not going to work?
I'm just going to go around a little bit more and come back to you, if I may. Yes, the man there in the dark blue sweater, yeah.
Yeah, I firmly believe the Labour manifesto is a lot of squash, because Corbyn's trying to take the country back to the 70s with his nationalisation and all that. Fundamentally not going to work. Fundamentally not going to work. The guy is an absolute loon.
Right. Let's not get a name calling. Come on. The guy in the shirt behind you, yes.
If we've got bodies like the IFS telling us that multiple parties are telling fibs, how, as voters, are we supposed to know who to trust?
And the woman in the second row with the glasses. Yes.
Mr. Cleverly, your policies have led to food banks and homelessness and children at the highest level in care. Those are your policies and your managing of the economy. Thank you very much.
Let me get around the rest of the panel, then you can come back in a minute. Ian.
I think there's real anger you can sense from the audience here tonight, and I can understand that, because we've lived with 10 years of austerity, and there is no question that that has been a political choice. You know, Richard talked about printing money. Well, the government has printed money because they embarked on a massive quantitative easing programme where they've taken 445 billion of your money and given it to the banks. That's why the banks' profits have gone up. So, you know, for the government to turn around and tell all of you that we all had to pay a price for the financial crisis, we bailed the banks out, and what this lot have done is they've given the banks back £445 billion of your money. That's money that should have been invested in public services. So the money always was there. It was a complete con from this government. And when you think of the reality of life for ordinary people, 1 in 4 children in the United Kingdom are now living in poverty. 65% of those in poverty are in work. And you had the situation where many millions of people were having to rely on working tax credits, and the Conservatives wanted to cut that. They willfully put people into poverty. And, you know, when you talk about the pensioners, you talk about 1950s women, and I agree on this with Anneliese, because it's an absolute disgrace that 3.8 million women had their pension rights taken from them. In many cases, they didn't know it was happening. They got 14 months' notice, and their pensional age was increasing from 60 to 66. How dare any government behave in such a manner to people that have worked all their life? Now, we costed proposals in the last Parliament that would have addressed this issue, and it simply is not right that we don't give compensation to this woman. But my final point, if I may, Fiona, we have some responsibility for tax in Scotland, and we have a progressive tax regime. We made sure that we invested an additional £600 million in our public services.
Well, should we just talk about the IFS in relation to the SNP as well, since we're banding around the Institute for Fiscal Studies so plentifully? They're suggesting about your general election pledges in independent Scotland could lead to more austerity in the short term. So they're not saying much, anything particularly complimentary about you either.
I have great respect for the IFS, but I would have to take issue with them because...
It always seems everyone has respect for the IFS when they're criticising other parties, but not their own.
Look at what we've done, because if people... You know, if people from Hull or elsewhere want to come and live in Scotland, they're very welcome, because we've mitigated some of the worst effects of Tory austerity. We've invested to make sure that we removed the bedroom tax that particularly punished the disabled, that were put into an perilous situation. We've tried to take actions where we can to take off the harsh edges of universal credit that were leading to people
OK, let's not go into a long list.
A lot of things that the Scottish Government have done, quite thankfully. We've taken our responsibilities, and unlike this lot, we balance our budget.
You've got a 7% deficit at the moment, as far as I'm aware. But, Ed.
No, the Scottish... hold on. The Scottish Government balances its budget. The deficit is a UK deficit. We don't have responsibility for that deficit. That's down to the UK Government, not us.
Scotland deficit is 7%, the UK deficit is 3%.
Yes, but that deficit is part of the function of being part of the United Kingdom.
OK.
If the UK Government wants to give us full control of our economy, we'll fix the deficit.
OK, hang on, let's get Ed.
Tax powers, you don't use them.
Let's let Ed get in here.
Let me go back to the questioner, Laura. You're absolutely right. The Tories and Labour Party are trying to say you can get something for nothing. That's nonsense. The IFS have shown, and they've said it in terms, that the Labour's proposals and the Tory proposals are not credible and they're not honest. Now, what did they say about the Liberal Democrat proposals? They said they were radical, but they said they were fiscally responsible. And why? Because you said that you were prepared to pay a little bit more in tax. We would ask you to do that. We'd ask for an extra penny on income tax to raise £7 billion a year for the NHS and the social care that so desperately need it. We'd ask corporations tax to go up to 20p in the pound to fund our promises on childcare. And through the Remain bonus by staying in the EU, getting the extra growth, the extra tax revenue, that would fund our school pledges as well. And so I'm really proud that the IFS of all the parties have backed ours as adding up, making sense. And that's why tonight, The Economist newspaper has also come out behind the Liberal Democrat plans as the only ones that are radical, would transform our society, invest in our health service, invest in our schools, invest in childcare, but they're costed. They make fiscal sense. So you can have a transformatory offer as long as you know where the money is going to come from and as long as you're prepared to pay for it.
Right. I did the UK a bit of a disservice. Our deficit is actually lower than 3%. It's just over 1%, I've just remembered. So just want to get that right. Let me tell you where we're going to be next week, because it's quite a week next week for Question Time, because we have another election special on Monday night, and this time with an audience of under 30s in York. So that rules out quite a few of us, I'm afraid. And that will be live on BBC One at 8:30 in the evening, and that's presented by my colleague Emma Barnett. So we're taking some questions from Twitter for this one. So if you want to ask a question, send it to us at #BBCQT. All 7 parties will be there. So put your question to all of them, or to one party in particular, or knock yourself out and do both. And after that, we'll be live in Wandsworth in London the day after the election. So that's at 8:30 p.m. on Friday the 13th. Who knows? Who knows what situation we'll be in by then? And if you want to be in the audience for either of those programmes, call 0330 123 99 88 or go to the Question Time website and follow the instructions there. Right, now I want to get on to a question that we've had quite a lot of interest from you on this particular subject, not surprisingly. Rebecca Hutchinson.
Good evening. Should convicted terrorists be allowed early release? And if so, what would be the provisions to protect the public?
So obviously this comes after the attack on London Bridge and the deaths of 2, by the sounds of it, extremely promising and wonderful young people. Ian, do you want to kick us off with this?
Yeah, but I think first and foremost we should think about those that have lost their lives. It's unspeakable what has happened on our streets, and of course we've lived too long with these incidents. Now, in the last Parliament, I was a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee, and I want to commend that committee for the work it does, and I think it's really important that that committee and other committees of Parliament consider very carefully the evidence of what took place last week, because the last thing we should be doing is rushing into knee-jerk actions. We need to make sure that we take a considered response, and we have to recognise that we've been living with a threat from terrorism for a considerable period of time, whether that's been from the types of people involved last week or indeed from right-wing terrorism as well. But we need to act in a measured and a dignified manner. But of course, as part of that, we do have to consider the arrangements for early release. And actually, the Scottish Government last year did change its legislation on automatic early release. But I do think that in amongst all of that, that we have to give consideration that what has happened to the resources in fighting terrorism.
And just, you might just want to explain how you changed it, because you stopped early release.
We have stopped early release for certain categories in Scotland, so we recognise that we had to look at this. So the Scottish Parliament has been doing the right thing in terms of taking an evidence-based approach and what we should be doing, because all of us have to recognise that we have as an obligation the security of the population and protecting people. That's first and foremost the obligation that we have. But we have to face the facts that in the UK, or certainly in England and Wales, that police numbers have been cut over the course of the last 10 years, and we can't escape that. Police numbers in England over the course of the last 12-year period are down by 13%. And I have to tell you, in Scotland, our police numbers have actually gone up over that period by close to 1,000. So we need to make sure that our police are properly resourced. We need to make sure that the security services are properly resourced for the job that they're doing as well. So let's have some calm reflection on what has happened. When Parliament gets back, I think we have to analyse the situation very carefully. But we need to recognise that 2 people have needlessly lost their lives as a consequence of what happened last week. And we need to make sure that we take appropriate action.
Ed, so the question from Rebecca is should convicted terrorists be allowed early release, obviously in relation particularly to what happened in London Bridge? And if they are allowed early release, what provisions should be in place to protect the public?
Can I say also thinking of the families and the friends and those people, brave people who got in the way and ran into danger, we should thank them profusely. But on the question, I'm against early release. This terrorist had been charged under a sentencing regime where he only had to serve 50% of his sentence, and his release was then automatic. That was wrong. Yeah. And actually, a Liberal Democrat minister, Lord McNally, put a bill before Parliament in 2012 and changed the law. The new law says that you must serve at least 2/3 of your sentence, and then your release is not automatic. It has to go to the parole board, and if the parole board says you're still dangerous, you're kept inside, rightly. And I'm proud that Liberal Democrats were part of a government that changed the law to get rid of that early release. And the tragedy here is that this terrorist was sentenced under the old law. Because if he'd been sentenced under the new law, he'd still be in prison. And we need to look at that. So, I think the law was rightly changed. I didn't know why the Prime Minister didn't realise that when he was interviewed. I'd have thought the Prime Minister would have known that, but apparently he didn't. But what's really important as we look at the new law and say, should that be changed, is I'd like us to think about the words of Jack Merritt's father. Jack Merritt had been working on rehabilitation, on de-radicalisation, to try to stop terrorism. And Jack Merritt's father said, please, no knee-jerk reactions, no trying to get cheap political points. I think we should listen to the father of the person who was killed.
The man in the front here.
So when it happened, all the news was based on the terrorist. Why weren't based on the three heroes? One with a fire extinguisher, one with a tusk, and then the absolute legend who ran in and rugby tackled him. Right. It was all on the terrorist.
Oh, but we have also heard a lot about the three people who fought so bravely to try and stop him. Yes, the woman here in the grey top.
Should we be actually thinking seriously about whether early release is appropriate for anybody? Let's face it.
Do you mean automatic early release?
Even early release, actually, because let's face it, early release happens because the prisons are absolutely full to bursting. They're full to bursting because people don't see prison as a deterrent. They are not actually being taught to change their ways. I accept that some people will never change their ways, but actually, early release just means that people go into prison knowing they'll get out sooner than whatever the sentence was.
OK. The one right at the back there with her hand up. Yes.
I think the real tragedy here and what we're not recognising is, unfortunately, as a society, we've allowed that terrorist to grow up amongst us. It was recognised at school that he was doing this already. I think somebody put a tweet out to say that he'd got pictures of Osama bin Laden and he was celebrating 9/11 and teachers were scared to say anything in case they were racist. And unless we stand up and say to these youngsters coming through, it is wrong. If we don't catch them then we end up putting them in prison. And then we go all the other way then and say, oh, no, now we can't let them out. Or, yes, we've got to let them out. We've got to just make a decision. We didn't let the Krays out. We didn't want to let Jack the Ripper out. 70 years old is not going to run around doing what he did. Not Jack the Ripper, the Yorkshire Ripper. Do you know what I mean? But,
we knew what you meant. Yeah.
But but at the end of the day, we can't say, oh, we can't do this because it's the Krays, and we do this because it's the Yorkshire Ripper. But then because it's a terrorist or that thing, we just got to blanket it and stand as a country and say, this is it. These are the rules. Regardless of, if this is what you've done, you stand for it and stop pussyfooting with your little snowflake decision.
Can I just ask, before I come to the rest of the panel, does anyone in the audience think actually there is a case, despite what happened last Friday, for early release in some circumstances for people? Yes, you put your hand straight up here, the man in the front.
I believe that people can be rehabilitated, because if you don't believe in that, what's the point of prison? You're just having a university for criminals if you don't believe that people can be rehabilitated. I think the case of
even someone who was as dangerous as a man can't.
Well, I think it depends on the offence, and I think with terrorism, you don't necessarily. How can you know on a de-radicalisation programme whether somebody is actually de-radicalised? I think you've got to be really careful. I think with terrorism offences, I wouldn't be in favour of early release. because there's such a danger to the public. But I think in general offences, you've got to have that principle of rehabilitation.
James?
The situation in London Bridge was terrible. I think everybody has said that at times like this, we do need to think about the impact on the family and friends of those who lost their lives. And the reference that Jack Marriott's father made to rehabilitation is absolutely right. And our criminal justice system does have to have, as one of its foundation stones, the desire to rehabilitate. But it must also have public protection at its heart as well. And there is sometimes a contradiction. Sometimes there's a tension between those two things. The individual who I'm not going to name, who was released and went on to murder Jack and Saskia, had superficially given all the impression that he'd been on a journey of rehabilitation, had been abiding by the conditions imposed upon him by his release, but clearly had the intention to go on and murder. And as the gentleman just said, it is particularly in terrorism as an area, it is really very difficult to assess whether someone has really been on that journey to rehabilitation. So the Prime Minister has been very, very clear, long before this incident, about his discomfort with early release for the most serious crimes, and that's something he has committed to continue to look at. I was involved when I worked with him at City Hall in London on a programme that looked at rehabilitation of young offenders in Feltham. So rehabilitation is incredibly important and must be a part of our criminal justice system. But as I say, that has to be balanced with the primary purpose, which is public protection.
Richard?
Look, I mean, to be honest, I think that for serious offenders, and we'll talk about terrorism here, for convicted terrorists, why are we thinking about early release at all? I think, the sentence is the sentence. And actually, surely what we need to calmly reflect upon is whether or not the sentences reflect the crime. And it may well be that actually, for these hideous terrorists, the sentence should be considerably longer.
But
and it just seems to me...
Richard, hang on a minute. What do you think then about the young man who died? His father has said he would be seething at his death and his life, being used to perpetuate an agenda of hate that he gave his everything fighting against.
Which is exactly why I said, we need to calmly reflect upon what are the right length of sentences for these very, very serious incidents of terrorism and serious violent offenders. And surely common sense dictates that if you've got violent criminals, terrorists, the idea of automatically releasing them without actually reviewing it, thinking about it, the parole board really look at it, just seems to lack all common sense. Of course, we should look at rehabilitating prisoners, but maybe we should be doing that rehabilitation, first of all, in prisons, rather than after we've released them.
Anneliese?
I'll be completely honest with you. I feel very, very uncomfortable pontificating about the exact drivers of what happened last Friday and what we need to do to deal with it. Because I'm not an expert in terrorism and what drives people to behave in that appalling way. I don't know exactly, perfectly, what the legal regime was at different times. Actually, it's changed, it seems to me, pretty continuously since 1991, when the possibility for automatic release came in. So I really do find it very difficult to answer that question, because I think when we talk about having that calm reflection, that means not jumping in and saying, right, this is just down to one factor. It means saying we've got to review what happened, both in that specific case about London Bridge, but more generally as well, because we know some of the people who've been involved in terrorist offences have been radicalised while they're in prison, or their radicalisation has got worse while they're in prison. So we need to look at all of these factors, and I don't think we should really be sitting here now in the heat of an election campaign and giving our tuppence worth about what we think should change. I think we should be looking at this carefully and making sure that people are safe and basing it on evidence, not on party politics.
Okay. The woman in the pink sweater.
May I observe that for
radical Islamic terrorists, their Quran allows them, and in fact more or less obliges them, to lie to the Kafirs. So they are allowed to lie, to say, yes, I am fine. It is part of their, it's permitted by the Quran to actually lie to those that you see as your enemies. So therefore, if they are, you know, it's perfectly good. That's part of their obligation.
Okay,
as
I mean, I think
Muslims.
you may be talking about a literal translation of the Quran, I don't know, but what I can say is there will be a whole hundreds, thousands, millions of Muslims who would disagree with you in terms of that being the way that they live their lives and the way they practice themselves.
We are talking about people who are highly radicalised and they are fundamentalists. And fundamentalists say that.
Say there are millions of Muslims who are peace-loving, who contribute to our society. And I have to tell you, I go to the mosque in my constituency and I meet them, and they meet the imams, listen to the Quran. I'm afraid they would have a very, very different interpretation of the Quran that you're giving.
They are not the people that become the terrorists. The people that become the terrorists are the fundamentalists who interpret the Quran in that way, and that is why they do what they do. They are not the proper Muslims. They're not the real Muslims. But the radical people sort of say, no, this is the way, because that is why they do it.
OK, the man here in the front of the check shirt.
As a recently retired instructional officer in the prison service for 23 years, when they do all these courses, I used to teach them wood skills and training and wood machining. Not many of them would conform and go and get a job, but a lot of them do courses so they can see the parole board and look what I've done. They get a bit earlier release. So it's not always giving them education on things, but they do it as a rite of passage to go earlier.
OK. And the woman behind you in the yellow striped cardigan.
I think this is a very cynical view of humanity. We need to fundamentally believe that people can change and people do want to be good. Prison isn't just a punitive thing. People do need to improve their life and have the opportunity to do so.
OK. Now, we haven't got much time left, and I just wanted to change the mood for a moment, coming to something so sombre and so serious, just to give us something to smile about. Let's have this last question from Jonathan Wynne.
Will the members of the panel be watching the Queen's speech on Christmas Day?
Well, we're not entirely sure if Jeremy Corbyn will or he won't. Come on, let's go around. Richard?
Yes, in the afternoon when it's shown.
Ed?
Yeah, I normally do. As you say, I've got a young daughter, 5 years old. She'll clamber all over me, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to hear what the Queen says, but I'll try my best.
You'll try your best. I think that's a no. Ian?
Yes, I mean, I will have to fit in with what the family are doing, but I guess it's something that we'll be on and that we'll be watching.
Are any of you going to admit if you don't actually watch the Queen's speech? Anneliese?
Yeah, my partner will be laughing his socks off at this moment because he always says, I always want to go for a walk on Christmas Day, and he just wants to sit inside and watch the telly. And so I used to always watch the Queen's speech. But he said, right, you want to go for a walk? OK, fine. We'll have our dinner then. We'll have it at 2 o'clock, and then you won't get your Queen's speech. You just have to sit there. And... Sorry, I'm not saying that I'm the only one who cooks it, by the way. I'm really going to be in trouble. Now, we all get involved in that. Yeah, he's not so keen on it, so he will be finding this extremely amusing at this point, I think.
James?
So I always intend to, and I always keep missing it. Because
so that's a no, come on.
Because it's at that perfectly awkward time.
Has it become a politically toxic to say that you don't watch the Queen's speech?
I don't think so. No, it's always right in the middle of when we're eating that kind of, Christmas lunch. It kind of runs into the afternoon. And suddenly I look at my watch and it's like 4:05, and once again, we've managed to miss it. I do try and catch it up. I'm a monarchist. I'm a Tory. What can I say? But I do like watching it. But I never manage to catch it when it goes out live, just like Jeremy Corbyn.
Right. Jonathan, what's your view on this?
Well, in my opinion, it doesn't seem like he actually does want to watch it. He's a Republican. He's on record for saying that. I think in the same sentence, though, he did say that he went to a homeless shelter as well. Yeah. Shouldn't that be more maybe that should be more of a headline than the fact that he clearly didn't watch the...
And the man at the back. The man at the back.
To say it's not a toxic issue, I mean, it's ridiculous that it is. But to say it's not a toxic issue ignores the fact that a party political leader said, no, I don't watch the Queen's speech, I go and help the homeless on Christmas Day. And the right-wing press came out and said he was an awful human being. It's absolute madness. It's absolute madness.
Yes, the man at the back, yeah.
I just think it's funny that people are attacking Corbyn for it when it's about 6.9 million people, I think, last year watched it, so I don't think the majority of Britain gives a toss. So I don't think it really matters, to be honest. So I watch it, but still, you know.
OK. Well, the man here in the white sweater.
Yeah, I'd just like to make reference to the hard workers of the NHS and the public servers on Christmas Day who won't actually have the choice of whether or not they can watch the Queen's speech. They'll be working really hard on Christmas Day, as they always have done, under really, really severe pressures currently.
Yeah. The man in the green top there, yes.
Well, Jeremy Corbyn has got the same initials as JC, as what we're all going to be celebrating on the 25th of December. So he walks on water anyway, so that isn't really a problem.
It's actually my birthday on Christmas Day.
Oh, Ed!
I sometimes even have to remind my family about it.
OK, let's take a final point up there, yes.
I think we just need to all be aware that this time of year, it's Christmas, it's all about giving, it's all about being together. Whether it's a general election, no matter what political views you are, and whether it's dealing with terrorism, whether it's whatever you deal with, the whole point of this season, the whole point of this time of year is we need to start coming together, not just as a country, but as human beings. And once we do that, we'll be able to tackle whatever issues in front of us, and that's it, really.
Yeah, here. OK, we've got time just for one more. Yes, the man in the short sleeve shirt.
It might just be nice to turn the TV off on Christmas Day and spend some time talking to your family.
Yeah. So even the Queen, and yes, in the blue sweater, the woman in the blue sweater.
Can all the politicians agree for Christmas not to have a go at each other?
Can you? Come on, guys. Is that your Christmas pledge? Oh, I'm not hearing yeses. Come on.
On Christmas Day, yeah.
On Christmas,
On Christmas Day.
Christmas Day.
On Christmas Day, we can take the day off, but when we get back, we're going to make sure we stop Brexit.
Oh, Ian, come on. Right, on that note, thank you for that point. Our hour is up, but don't forget the question time. We'll be back on Monday for that special programme, live at 8:30 in the evening on BBC One from York with Emma Barnett and an audience of under 30s. Every time I say that, I feel more and more ancient, actually. But anyway, so please send in a question on Twitter at #BBCQT, and you never know, we might pick that question. And I'll be back the day after the election on Friday the 13th at 8:30 in the evening from Wandsworth in London. I, for one, am hugely looking forward to that programme. So call 0330 123 99 88 if you'd like to be in the audience, or, as always, you can go to the Question Time website and you can follow the instructions there. And if you want to have your say on tonight's topics, you can go to Question Time Extra Time, which is on 5 Live now. But for now, thank you very much to my panel, to the audience here, and of course to you at home for watching and listening from Hull. Bye-bye.
With help from the Dead Ringers team, Brexit Cast follows in just a moment on BBC One.